I commend the bill to the House.
Mr.
The
Speaker.
question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
Phil Twyford.
Thank you. Labor is supporting this bill to Select Committee because we judge that there's enough in this bill that it's worth giving some serious scrutiny at Select Committee. And I'll have something to say about each of the three main provisions in the bill. But it's our argument that it's a bit strange, actually, that Nick Smith would bring a bill like this to the House to improve rental conditions. Three practical but fairly minor improvements that need to be made. When the housing market and the rental market are in a state of meltdown, and the half of the New Zealand population that is living in rental housing, a significant proportion of those people are living in despair at the moment because they are desperately trying to keep their heads above water in the face of skyrocketing rents, poor quality housing, and what is essentially an unregulated market. But we'll come back to that, Mr. Speaker. The first part of this bill that I want to comment on is the provisions that deal with methamphetamine contamination. The bill will give landlords easier access to properties to allow for the testing for methamphetamine contamination, and it will allow both landlord and tenant the right to terminate a tenancy if tests come back at unsafe levels. The bill also, I think, helpfully sets up a regulation-making power to set the standards and the guidelines for meth testing, including what would be the maximum acceptable level of contamination. Now, Nick Smith, I think, told Radio New Zealand earlier today that I cannot be a miracle man. Nick, the country doesn't want you to be a miracle man. The country wants you to do your job as housing minister and do something about the appalling conditions that renters in this country are facing and the plummeting rate of home ownership that now sees, on your watch, Nick Smith, the lowest rate of home ownership since 1951. It's fallen every week that you've been in the job, Nick Smith, since you took it on as housing minister. So the country doesn't want miracles, they just want the minister to do his job. And to be honest, Nick Smith, you have sat around for 3 years, while cowboy meth testing companies have preyed on the anxieties of tenants and landlords. And because of this minister's absolute negligence, Housing New Zealand alone has wasted $30 million, $30 million testing state houses that they thought were contaminated with meth and remediating those state houses. Hundreds of families have been needlessly evicted because of faulty meth testing standards and guidelines that the government was responsible for, that this minister, Nick Smith, the incompetent Nick Smith, sat around for 3 years while that $30 million was wasted and more than 500 State House tenants were evicted on the basis of faulty evidence, of testing procedures and standards that simply cannot distinguish between homes that have a residue of methamphetamine that might be harmful to people's health and a residue that poses no risk to anyone's health. The testing and the standards that Nick Smith has presided over cannot distinguish between a home that has been used as a pee lab and a home where someone has smoked pee. The former is a serious risk to people's health, the latter poses no risk. And yet that minister has sat on his hands and done nothing while tens of millions of dollars have been wasted and hundreds of people needlessly evicted by the government's state housing agency. The provisions in this bill are long overdue, but it needs to be said that without proper regulation of the meth testing industry that has grown up in the last few years in response to this problem and in a situation of moral panic about pee contamination, this government has allowed lack of proper information, lack of data, lack of decent standards and no accountability to meth testing agencies who have made a killing at the expense of landlords and tenants. So it's 3 years overdue, but what I say to this House, and I hope we'll have the opportunity to have this debate in the Select Committee, is that without proper regulation of the meth testing and remediation agencies, these provisions are very unlikely to be effective. The other area that I want to touch on is that this bill basically clarifies the law around intentional damage, careless or intentional damage by a tenant. And as the Minister said, the Osaki case, the Court of Appeal found in April last year, it applied the provisions in the Property Law Act that usually apply to the commercial property industry. It applied them to residential tenancies and basically changed the law that up until that time had meant that, that tenants who were obligated to pay for the costs of damage to rental premises caused by intentional or careless damage. And basically the Court of Appeal ruled that tenants are immune from a claim by a landlord where the rental property is damaged by careless or negligent action. And the effect of that was essentially to let tenants off the hook. It meant landlords could no longer pass on, for example, the cost of their insurance excess to tenants. And I think it's widely agreed that it has tipped the law too far in favour of tenants, and there's no disincentive for careless or intentional damage. So what the officials and what the ministers tried to come up with is a new formula that will provide a better balance of liabilities between landlord and tenants, that will encourage tenants to take care and not expose them to potentially the risky and expensive legal action that insurance companies could take. So we look forward to debating this in Select Committee. I know that the Property Investors Federation have some doubts about whether or not the right balance has been struck here, and I look forward to hearing from them and also the various tenants advocacy groups who I know were consulted by MB officials in developing this bill, but it will be good to really tease that out at Select Committee and see whether or not this particular formula strikes the most appropriate balance. The third aspect that I want to finish on is that this bill aims to strengthen the powers for prosecuting landlords who have rented out unsuitable accommodation, such as garages, warehouses and industrial buildings. And there was one very notable case, I think it was 61 Molesworth Street, where at the time of the Wellington earthquakes, the ratbag owner of that building had rented out a lot of that commercial space to tenants, and they were found to be living in not only kind of unsafe and unsuitable accommodation, but what the bill points out is that if people aren't in a premises that are consented for residential purposes, then the landlords cannot be held to the provisions of the Residential Tenancies Act. So we applaud the intent of this, but it is ironic for a government who has overseen an explosion in the number of New Zealanders living in substandard and overcrowded housing, whether it's unconsented garages, and we've seen cases of Work and Income New Zealand referring people who would otherwise be homeless to live in unconsented garages in people's backyards. It's ironic that a government that has presided over that is now spending $100,000 a day on putting homeless people up in motels, is cracking down on this particular aspect of it, sir. And I want to finish with the point that there is a massive reform agenda to fix the housing crisis and make conditions better for renters. There are so many things that need to be done to improve the quality of rental accommodation, to give renters more security of tenure, to curb the property speculation that's driving house prices and rents through the roof. But this government prefers to focus on fairly small and relatively inconsequential matters when it brings a bill like this to the House.
Mr. Speaker.
Andrew Bailey.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to be talking